Hey, cohort friends. I don't know what to. David Cottle says he always laughs at the beginnings of my cohort lessons because I'm always wondering whether anybody's watching. I know that some of you are, and it's been a busy time, but this is good. What we've been talking about will be good just to have as a record, and people can go back and look at it if you ever need it. Last time we talked some about the Gospel of John, an introduction to studying the Gospel of John. This time I want to talk about two things related to the Gospel of John. First, I want to put the Gospel into the writing of it into a historical context that actually comes out of the book of Acts. We'll talk about that. And then I want to give you a few things to always look for when you're studying the Gospel of John. I think I mentioned the last time, but almost all of the early church fathers who spoke about John, they all said the same thing, that he ended up living in Ephesus. We don't know when he moved there, but they say that he not only ended up living there the last years of his life, but that he actually brought Jesus' mother with him. And so there's the grave of John the Baptist, or two of them, or John, not John the Baptist, John the disciple, and then the grave of Mary. It is purported to be in Ephesus, and this would make sense if John had been told by Jesus to take care of his mother for him. And we find out about I would say, the cultural givens, if you will, in Ephesus when John would have arrived, at some time when he would have arrived. We find it in the book of Acts. If you look at chapter 19 in the book of Acts, you're going to see that Paul arrived in Ephesus to bring the gospel there for the first time. And what he found was that there were some Jewish disciples of John the Baptist living in Ephesus, that they were following the law, and that they were following it with great, I would say, fervor, because they felt that it was important that they get their lives prepared for the coming of the Messiah. If you recall, John the Baptist's message was, prepare the way for the Messiah. Well, here in Ephesus, Paul finds a bunch of Jews who are living the way that John the Baptist had preached in preparation for the coming for the Messiah. And this is a really Jewish thing. I mean, there was a huge Jewish population in Ephesus to begin with. Remember, Ephesus is up where Turkey is now. And even though the various groups of Jews would have defined what the Messiah, when he came, looked like, you had all of this sort of soup of, we're getting ready for the Messiah to come. And so Paul introduces all of these people who are disciples of John the Baptist to the message of Jesus as the fulfillment of John the Baptist's preaching. And it says in the book of Acts that 12 men followed Paul's teaching. Now, that isn't exactly a groundswell when you consider how many Jews actually lived in Ephesus. But Paul spoke there for 3 months in the synagogues until some of the Jews it uses the word obstinate, and the followers of Jesus were actually pushed out of the synagogues, and they had to go into public lecture halls to have their meetings. And so what ends up happening is the Ephesian Jewish community is now divided into two very distinct groups. One is the followers of the old Jewish ways, and they could not accept that Jesus was the Messiah, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And then there are the people who have now become followers of Jesus. In fact, during the time that even Paul was there, and you can read about it in the book of Acts, that there was a threat to the Ephesian commercial world connected with the worship of Artemis. They made these little statues, and people got all worked up because they were blaming the Jewish community, and now particularly this Christian community, that people were following this Jesus, and they were not buying the statues and things anymore that they made in Ephesus. And so there was even a riot about that. And when that riot happened, the Jewish community that did not want to follow Jesus did everything they could to separate out separate out the two groups: Christian following Jesus, Jewish Christian following Jesus, and Jewish not following Jesus. One other thing about Ephesus, that the Jews had been given very special privileges under the Roman law and even the local law, and the Jews were resented by the Gentile population because they got special privileges from the government. And so whenever there was any kind of fuss between the Jews and the Gentiles, the Jews would always say, well, it's those Christians that are causing the trouble. It's those Christians that are causing the trouble, not us. We're over here. Anyway, what we see is that the Christian community is now being persecuted, if you will, by other Jews. And this is a given. This is a given. And so what is going on in the Ephesian world is this. There are Jews who are really given over to still following John the Baptist, and they're looking for the Messiah. Here, the two things that those people could not accept about the Jesus Messiah, Jesus being the Messiah, was one, that the Messiah had been crucified. They're like, no, crucifixion is an impossibility for our Messiah. And secondly, Gentiles were also being invited into the fellowship. So this is like unimaginable to these Jews who've been following the law as closely as they can, because John the Baptist said the Messiah is coming pretty soon, and they're over here still following it, and they don't want anything to do with this new message over here. And so we want to focus in on the Christians. They are not only under persecution, but they have to be given something that tells them that Jesus is better, bigger, higher, whatever you want to say, than John the Baptist. And also, they have to have something that encourages them that this Messiah that they've never met, they're just hearing about them, he said things that would let them know that he actually loves them and cares for them. So John, the disciple, moves into this mess. And as he's getting older, and he's been telling the Christians there the stories that he knows about Jesus, he gets older, and it comes time to write down what it is that he remembers that he's not seeing in the other Gospels. And he's got 3 things that he knows he's got to do. In his gospel, he's got to do 3 things that are going to encourage those Ephesian Christians who need to be encouraged by what he says in the gospel. First, he needs to lift up Jesus as high as he can. He needs to make sure that Jesus is shown to be greater and more amazing than anyone who's ever lived, particularly John the Baptist. And so you'll see, as you read the Gospel of John, his Christology, as they call it, is so high. He even starts out with that amazing beginning. And he puts in John the Baptist's mouth over and over and over, John the Baptist saying, I'm not the Messiah, he's the Messiah. I have to get smaller, he has to get bigger. John the Baptist, almost all the quotes that we have of John the Baptist about Jesus are in the Gospel of John, and they're all John the Baptist denigrating himself and lifting up Jesus. And this is what John, the disciple, does completely throughout his gospel. He lifts him up. The second thing he has to do is he has to show clearly that Jesus is the Messiah, and so he constantly shows him to be what? The Son of God. He talks about it all the time. If you look at how John describes Jesus, it's in someone who has some kind of otherworldly knowledge and connection to God. He is just not a regular person at all. And then third thing he needs to do is he needs to give a clear message of comfort to the Ephesians who are no longer able to go to the Jewish Ephesian Christians, who are no longer able to go to the synagogue. They're not able to participate in any Jewish, I would say, cultural things. They needed confidence from John as he wrote his gospel that Jesus' message would keep their hearts afire. And so what do we get in John's gospel? We get over and over Jesus being what? The loving Messiah, telling us how, for God so loved the world, and this kind of thing, all over the place. Jesus constantly is speaking of his love for his brothers and sisters, and at the end he prays for those who are going to become followers of Jesus after the disciples have started to spread the message. It's all kinds of stuff like that. And they also needed to know, and this is interesting because in John's Gospels, where we get most of this stuff, is where it is the technical term for the Jewish leadership in the Gospels. Primarily, the Gospel of John is the Jews. The leadership of the Jews are called the Jews. This doesn't speak for all Jews. It's for the Jews. And guess who are the people who are now persecuting the Christians in Ephesus? The leadership of the Jews, the Jews. Jesus knows what it is to have his own Jewish brothers and sisters persecute him. And he says over and over through his gospel, John does, that this is normal. We Jewish followers of Jesus are going to get it just like Jesus did, and he knows about it, and he cares about you in the midst of it. Those lenses, when you think about it, when you look through those three lenses, that we have to lift up Jesus, that we have to let everybody know how high he is and that he's better than John the Baptist, and that Jesus is clearly the Messiah, and that he suffered under the same kind of people. If you think about those things as you go through the gospel, you'll see what John is trying to do. He's trying to speak to a very particular community in a city where he now lives, so that they will have not only Jesus' words and deeds that he remembers, but they'll also be encouraged personally by it. This is what is happening as he writes this gospel. Now, so far, I'm just going to sum up a little bit of what I've said over the last couple of weeks. First, John is speaking to the Ephesian church. It's a church that's under persecution because they've even been driven out of the synagogue system. And they're being persecuted by Jews who don't want anything to do with the Messiah who's been crucified, or who would also speak to Gentiles. And that the Christians are also being persecuted by the local people who think they're bad citizens because they won't participate in the idol worship ceremonies to the gods, and they won't buy the stuff that they sell at the religious ceremonies and things like that. And these people need to be comforted and told that Jesus is with them and he loves them in the midst of their circumstances. This is really important. It also will speak to us, because we need to know that Jesus loves us and that he is a Messiah worth following no matter what our circumstances are. This is all really important as we look at the Gospel of John. Now, I want to talk now just briefly about a few images that John uses constantly. And the first one is the biggest one, and it actually has to do with John the Baptist. As you read the Gospel of John, always look for water. Look for water. It's everywhere. Water is everywhere. And in this gospel, John the Baptist's primary deal was that he told everybody that they were so sinful, so far from what God. Well, let me just say first off, just quickly, baptism was only used to bring Gentiles into the Jewish faith. Jews never got baptized, just Gentiles who were becoming followers of Judaism. And so when John the Baptist said, all you people are so bad that you need to come out here to the river and get baptized, what he was saying was that you're so bad that you're just like Gentiles, and you need to be what? And you know what they called it? Born again. They needed to be born again like Gentiles needed to be done when they were dunked under the water. And so John the Baptist's message was all about water. It was all about water. And what John in the gospel writing does, he says that Jesus, there's some kind of power in that water that says that I'm now reborn. It's sort of not even mystical, it's more of a metaphorical thing. But Jesus shows everybody, I'm way more powerful than water. He does all kinds of miracles with water, and he walks on water, and he stops water from coming from the sea. He does all kinds of stuff with water in the Gospel of John. So you just look for that. Now I'll give you some examples. John the Baptist starts out speaking, saying, I baptize you with water, but Jesus is going to baptize you with the Spirit. And so he's saying, my water's okay, but his Spirit's like way bigger, way bigger. And that's another John the Baptist saying he's more important than I am. That's what that is. And Jesus' first miracle is what? In the Gospel of John. He turns water into wine. Now, the water was actually in the big amphora jars, these huge amphora jars that held about 30 to 40 gallons of water. And they used that water was not for drinking. That water at that wedding was for water to cleanse yourself from the impurities of the world. The implication was that you got everybody else's sin and dirt on you when you were out in the world, and so you would cleanse yourself in these big jars. And now what does Jesus do? He turns the water that cleanses the sin of the world off of you to wine. And what is wine the symbol of? It's the symbol of Jesus' blood, which what? Saves us from all sin for eternity. Let's just talk about Jesus' power over water in that one. He's like his water goes to wine, which is a way bigger thing than having to wash yourself every time you get into the wine of Jesus' blood, and you get saved from sin for eternity. That's a huge thing. And then Jesus tells Nicodemus what? We must be born of water, which is like John's baptism, and born of the Spirit. He's talking about the difference between them and what? And that water birth is a precursor to what? Spiritual rebirth. And go back and look at those. There's water everywhere. And Jesus talks to a Samaritan woman at the well. But interestingly, it's right after that event of Jesus talking to the woman at the well is right after John the Baptist gets done saying, he must be greater and I must be less. And then suddenly Jesus is talking to a Samaritan woman at a well, and what's he tell her? He says, I have living water that you know not of. And then he says, drink of what? Me. Drink of me and never thirst again. Like he's talking about water. And then Jesus, and only in John, Jesus goes to a pool in Bethsaida where there's a pool, and if they said that an angel comes down and touches the water and the first person in gets healed, and there's been a man there that's been crippled there for years, and he can't get into the water because when it stirs, nobody will help him get in, and Jesus says what? That doesn't matter. He just heals him. He proves that he has greater authority for healing power than that water does. In the Gospel of John, guess what Jesus does in that Gospel of John? He walks on water. He walks on water. And you want to talk about showing your authority over something, he walks on water. Right at the end of the Gospel, this is the only place where we find out that Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. He said, if you've had a bath, then you only need to get your feet washed. Well, who was giving people a bath? John the Baptist, when he baptized people, gave people a bath. But Jesus says, if once I've washed your feet with water, then you have been what? Washed completely. So the implication is that his water washing of their feet completes something far grander than what the first baptism, the first washing or bath from John the Baptist ever did. And then one other thing, the gospel begins with John speaking alongside water, calling people to repentance because the Messiah is coming. And the gospel actually ends with Jesus speaking alongside of a body of water, revealing himself as the Messiah and the Lord and the Savior. Both ends of John's gospel start beside water, but one is in preparation of what the end is. Boom, water, water, water. Okay, so it's everywhere. It's primarily because of John the Baptist's entire ministry was characterized by water baptism, but then the gospel itself shows Jesus' interaction with water, which will lead us to the fact that Jesus has a spiritual ministry that is far grander, and that he has power over water in any way you want to talk about it. Okay, that's the water thing. And then secondly, this gospel is really personal. It's not an apologetic gospel like the synoptics are. The synoptics tend to work to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. And this gospel is always saying, who do you think he is after the way you see he treats you or the way he cares about you? This gospel is directed right to touch our hearts by hearing how much Jesus loves us and he cares about us. So when you're reading, always look for ways that suddenly what Jesus is saying or doing, it actually speaks into us. Why did John write it that way? Because he was the disciple who was so loved by Jesus. And also he knew that the Ephesian Christians needed to know they were loved by Jesus. And he also knew that anybody else who read this for a long time would need to know that they were loved by Jesus. There's another part about this gospel that you want to look for. They're called John's asides. And what this is that John continually places himself in the story by butting in and telling us something. Now, here's the cool part. He tends to butt in and tell us something because he knew that there were highly Jewish known stuff from back in Judah and in Jerusalem and Galilee and places like that everybody there would know about that stuff, but nobody's going to know about it in Ephesus because they live in Turkey. They don't live in Israel. You see what I'm saying? And so there's like, if in chapter 4, verse 2, he stops the narrative and he goes, and here's who's actually baptizing people. Here's who are doing these things. Or one time in the 4th chapter, he stops and tells the difference between Jews and Samaritans, as if the people reading it would not have known. They wouldn't have known the distinction between Samaritans because they don't live around Samaritans. And he stops in chapter 6 and tells us some things on the side about Judas. Like, who's going to know about Judas, details about Judas, if he doesn't tell them? Because they're not in the other Gospels. And one of the biggest, like the disciples' understandings of things, he will stop and say, now they weren't quite sure, nobody knew quite sure what he was talking about here, or they all scratched their head. And so you'll see that in chapter 12, that's where that is. The biggest aside is in chapter 3. When John, the writer of the gospel, he's had this thing where Jesus is talking, and then all of a sudden he stops, and he goes, and it's John 3:16 to John 3:21. It's a whole big aside about actually the purpose of Jesus' whole ministry right at the beginning, just so that everybody gets the point at the front. You know, it's like, here's what's going on. Now, I know that if you have a red letter Bible, they're going to put John 3:16 to 21 in red. The Bible was not written with red letters. The whole of John's gospel is filled with asides. Jesus would have never stopped having been talking about himself in the regular first person and everything, and then gone to third person. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish. I mean, he's not going to talk about himself that way. This is a long aside that's actually a treatise on what the gospel is. And it's an aside by John to let us know something we wouldn't be able to figure out unless we had him stop and tell us. Those are everywhere. Look for John's explanations. Again, he was pretty sure, I'm confident, that he had to add those things because Ephesian people wouldn't have known about some of that stuff. So he sticks it in there. Another thing is there's a constant, unending mantra that where is Jesus from? Where is he from? And I know that this is a lot of modern commentators focus on this because Jesus says over and over and over and over that I and the Father are one, and that I came from the Father, and that I came with a message from God. He says it over and over and over, and some modern commentators said he was delusional and crazy because he said it all the time. Well, no, the truth is this. If he'd only said one time that I am one with the Father and that I came from heaven to be here on a mission because I was told by the Father what to say. If he said it one time, we'd all scratched our heads and said, what was that about? It's kind of a bold statement to make. Was he crazy or what? But he said it. No, he said it over and over and over and over so that we would finally come to the conclusion that he believed it. And maybe we ought to think about it. And if he did come from the Father, and he is one with the Father, and that he came on a mission that he was told by God to tell us, that makes a huge difference in how we think about who he is. So watch for that, because he's going to say it. You're going to get sick of him saying, I am one with the Father, and I came from the Father, and the Son and the Father are one. You get tired of that, but John is making sure that we know that Jesus said it all the time. And finally, look for this business about the Jews as a group. This is a specific designation in John. It's the religious leadership. Just look for those references, because what you'll see in those references is the kind of directions that persecution will tend to take when they come to Christians. The Ephesian Christians were getting it, and the Jews, if you will, the leadership of the Jewish religion, they're not unique in the way that they want to stamp out Christianity. Lots of people who are opposed to it would do exactly the same things. Just watch that. I think that's plenty of stuff to get you started reading the Gospel of John. Hey, it's a tough gospel. When I taught it, it took me 3 years to teach it. I have those notes if you want them. It's a big file, but it's really worth the effort. It is really worth the effort. I hope this helps. I'll see you in a couple weeks. And if you got through the whole thing, thank you. Okay, I love you guys. Bye.